November 4, 1962. Somewhere over the skies of central Cuba, roughly 8 miles west of Santa Clara, the morning sun cast long shadows across the sugarcane fields below as 2 American F-104C Starfighters from the 479th Tactical Fighter Wing cruised at high altitude. They were flying a reconnaissance support mission, providing cover for Navy photo aircraft documenting Soviet military installations on the island. The pilots had flown similar missions throughout the tense weeks since the Cuban Missile Crisis began. They expected nothing unusual. Then something appeared on their 6 o'clock position. It came from below and behind, climbing at a rate no American pilot had ever witnessed from a Soviet aircraft. The closure rate was extraordinary. Within seconds, a silver dart with swept delta wings materialized alongside them, close enough to see the red star painted prominently on its fuselage. The pilot of the approaching aircraft, a Soviet officer from the 32nd Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, whose name remains classified in Russian archives to this day, positioned his MiG-21 F-13 directly behind the lead American jet. The Soviet pilot was not there by accident. Operation Anadyr had secretly deployed 40 of these advanced interceptors to Cuba 2 months earlier. The American intelligence community had completely missed their arrival. Now one of these phantom aircraft had caught 2 of America's fastest fighters completely by surprise. The Soviet pilot centered his gun sight on the lead starfighter and held position. Then he mimicked pulling the trigger. His thumb pressed the firing button, but the safety was engaged. The guns did not fire. This was a simulated attack, a message delivered at more than 500 miles per hour over hostile territory. The Soviet pilot held his firing position for several agonizing seconds, demonstrating complete tactical control of the engagement. He could have destroyed both American aircraft. He wanted them to know it. Every second he remained on their tail drove home the point with brutal clarity. Then he peeled away into a climbing turn, leaving the 2 American pilots with a stark and terrifying realization. They had just been intercepted and virtually killed by an aircraft they had been told did not exist in Cuba. Their response was immediate and unambiguous. Both starfighters pushed their throttles to maximum military power, then lit their afterburners. The massive J-79 engines roared as 17,000 pounds of thrust pushed each aircraft forward. They fled north toward Florida at maximum speed, neither pilot attempting to engage, neither considering turning to fight. They had been caught completely by surprise, bounced from below by a fighter that matched or exceeded their own performance capabilities. The engagement, from first contact to disengagement, lasted less than 90 seconds. In aerial combat terms, it was an eternity. American radio operators monitoring the Florida Straits from listening posts along the Keys intercepted the pilots' frantic transmissions. According to declassified signals, intelligence reports compiled by the National Security Agency, the F-104 pilots reported being intercepted by fast jets bearing red stars. Their voices carried the unmistakable edge of pilots who had just survived an encounter they should not have survived. Some accounts from Cuban aviation historians who later gained access to Soviet records suggest they described the attackers as pirate planes without insignia. The contradiction in these reports has never been fully resolved, though both versions may contain elements of truth depending on exactly what the pilots saw in those chaotic moments. Either way, the message reaching American commanders at Tactical Air Command and Air Defense Command was unmistakably clear. The pilots had encountered something in Cuban airspace that outclassed their expectations entirely. The Soviet Union had placed advanced supersonic fighters within 90 miles of the American mainland, and American intelligence had failed to detect them. Within 24 hours of the encounter, every MiG-21 in Cuba was repainted with Cuban national markings. The era of Soviet aircraft flying with Soviet insignia over the Caribbean was abruptly over. Moscow understood that American pilots identifying red-starred jets over Cuba would report direct Soviet involvement in any future incident. The political implications were far too dangerous during a period when the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. From that day forward, Soviet pilots in Cuba flew aircraft bearing the blue and white and red colors of Fidel Castro's Revolutionary Air Force. The fiction of Cuban operation would be maintained even as Soviet aviators continued to fly combat missions. The following day, November 5, 1962, MiG-21s intercepted American aircraft near the same area. This time the targets were Navy RF-8, a Crusaders from Light Photographic Squadron VFP-62, conducting Operation Blue Moon low-level photo reconnaissance missions over Cuban military installations. These dangerous flights brought unarmed reconnaissance aircraft at low altitude over heavily defended enemy territory to photograph missile sites, airfields, and troop concentrations. The MiG pilots pursued aggressively, diving on the slower Crusaders from above and behind. The Navy aviators, veterans of countless reconnaissance missions, managed to escape by diving to extremely low altitude and using terrain features to break contact. They hugged the treetops, weaving through valleys, making themselves difficult targets for the pursuing fighters. American reconnaissance aircraft approached MiG-21 bases in Cuba with considerably more caution after these harrowing encounters. These encounters, which the American public would not learn about for decades due to classification, would reshape United States air defense strategy for years to come. They revealed a terrifying gap in the defense of the continental United States. Soviet fighters could now reach Florida in minutes. American cities from Miami to Jacksonville lay within their combat radius. And they would lead to one of the most unusual fighter deployments of the entire Cold War, when America stationed its fastest interceptor at the very tip of Florida to guard against an enemy just 90 miles away across the warm turquoise waters of the Caribbean. This is the story of the F-104 Starfighter and its 6-year vigil against Cuban MiGs. It is a story of technological rivalry at the edge of nuclear annihilation, of young pilots who sat on 5-minute alert in the brutal Florida heat waiting for a battle that never came, and of the single most embarrassing moment in American air defense history, when that same enemy landed a jet fighter beside the president's airplane without anyone noticing until it was far too late. The Lockheed F-104 Starfighter was unlike any fighter aircraft that had come before it. When legendary designer Clarence Leonard Kelly Johnson began sketching its outlines in the winter of 1952, he had one goal burned indelibly into his mind. American pilots returning from the bitter skies over Korea had told him what they desperately needed. The Soviet MiG-15 had shocked them with its performance, climbing and turning with their F-86 Sabres in ways they had never anticipated. In the frozen skies above the Yalu River, American pilots had learned painful lessons about what happened when the enemy possessed superior aircraft. These combat veterans wanted something radically different for the next war. They wanted the smallest, fastest, highest climbing fighter that human engineering could possibly produce. They wanted, as they described it, a missile with a man in it. Kelly Johnson assembled his hand-picked team at Lockheed's legendary Skunk Works facility in Burbank, California, and set to work with characteristic intensity. Over the following months, they studied more than 100 different aircraft configurations, ranging from small, nimble designs weighing just 8,000 pounds to massive twin-engine fighters approaching 50,000 pounds. Johnson kept returning obsessively to the smallest options. He understood that aerodynamic drag increased exponentially with aircraft size, and that the key to ultimate performance lay in minimizing everything except the engine. Every pound of weight not absolutely essential for the mission was weight that would slow the aircraft down. The aircraft that emerged from these exhaustive studies looked like nothing else in aviation history. Its fuselage was impossibly thin and needle-sharp, barely wider than its single General Electric J-79 turbojet engine. The airframe appeared more like a guided missile than a manned fighter. Pilots who saw it for the first time often remarked that it looked like someone had strapped wings to a drainpipe. Its wings were so small and sharp that ground crews required protective covers over the leading edges to avoid lacerating themselves during routine maintenance. The leading edge thickness measured just 0.41 millimeters at its narrowest point, thin enough to slice through the air with minimum resistance but genuinely dangerous to the unwary. More than one technician required stitches after careless contact with those razor wings. The wingspan measured just 21 feet and 11 inches, roughly half that of contemporary fighters like the North American F-100 Super Sabre. Those tiny wings were not designed for dogfighting maneuverability or sustained turns. They were designed for one purpose only: piercing the sound barrier and beyond with absolute minimum aerodynamic drag. The wing loading, The ratio of aircraft weight to total wing area was extraordinarily high compared to any fighter that had flown before. This gave the Starfighter excellent high-speed characteristics and phenomenal rate of climb, but made it demanding and unforgiving at low speeds and during landing approaches. Pilots would learn to respect those small wings through painful experience, and many would die when they failed to give them sufficient respect. On March 4, 1954, the prototype F-104 took to the skies for the first time, with Lockheed test pilot Anthony "Tony" LaVie at the controls. LaVie was a legendary aviator who had tested some of the most dangerous experimental aircraft ever built. Even he was impressed by what Johnson had created. The aircraft proved everything the designer had promised. Within months, test pilots were pushing it past Mach 2, twice the speed of sound. The Starfighter became the first operational fighter in history capable of sustained flight at such extreme velocities, not merely a brief dash through the sound barrier, but continuous supersonic cruise for extended periods. The world records fell in rapid succession, as Lockheed and the Air Force demonstrated the Starfighter's capabilities to an amazed aviation community. On May 7, 1958, Major Howard C. Johnson climbed an F-104A to an altitude of 91,243 feet, shattering the existing world altitude record. 9 days later, on May 16, Captain Walter W. Irwin established a new world speed record of 1,404.19 miles per hour in level flight. The Starfighter became the first aircraft in aviation history to hold simultaneous official world records for both maximum speed and maximum altitude. It would later add time to climb records as well, reaching extreme altitudes faster than any aircraft before it. The raw performance numbers told only part of the remarkable story. The F-104's initial rate of climb exceeded 48,000 feet per minute under optimal atmospheric conditions. Pilots who flew the aircraft in operational squadron service later described being able to reach 45,000 feet in approximately 90 seconds from brake release on a standard 85-degree Fahrenheit day at combat weight configuration. This was not gradual acceleration like other fighters. This was being fired from a cannon. The sensation of afterburner acceleration pressed pilots back into their ejection seats with relentless force as the aircraft clawed for altitude. The horizon tilted crazily as the climb angle exceeded 45 degrees, then steepened further. The altimeter unwound so fast it was difficult to read. The aircraft's General Electric J-79 turbojet engine represented the cutting edge of American propulsion technology. Early versions produced approximately 15,000 pounds of thrust with full afterburner engaged. Later variants received progressively more powerful engines as General Electric refined the design. The ultimate version fitted to aircraft at Homestead Air Force Base, the J-79 GE-19, produced 17,900 pounds of thrust and pushed the service ceiling beyond 73,000 feet into the stratosphere, where the sky turned black and the curvature of the Earth became visible. Standard armament consisted of a single M61 Vulcan 20mm rotary cannon mounted in the lower left fuselage beneath the cockpit. This revolutionary weapon represented a quantum leap in fighter armament. The 6-barrel rotating design could fire 6,000 rounds per minute, delivering devastating firepower in the brief moments of a high-speed intercept engagement. Aerial combat at Mach 2 happens incredibly fast. Targets remain in the gun sight for fractions of seconds. The Vulcan's tremendous rate of fire meant that even the briefest trigger pull would send dozens of shells toward the enemy. Additionally, AIM-9B Sidewinder infrared homing missiles could be mounted on rails at the wingtips, giving the Starfighter beyond visual range engagement capability against targets whose hot jet exhausts could be detected by the missile's seeker head. The F-104 was designed for a specific tactical concept that matched the threats American planners anticipated in the late 1950s. It would sit on ground alert at airfields around the nation, pilots standing by in ready rooms, aircraft armed and fueled. When radar stations detected enemy bombers approaching, the interceptors would scramble. Their phenomenal climb rate would carry them to intercept altitude in minutes rather than the quarter-hour or more required by previous fighters. Their blazing speed would allow them to reach the incoming bombers before those aircraft could threaten American cities with nuclear weapons. Their cannon and missiles would destroy the threat. Then they would return home, ideally in time to refuel and rearm before the next wave of bombers arrived. In an era when American military planners feared hundreds of Soviet Tupolev Tu-95 Bear and Myasishchev Mi-4 Bison bombers crossing the Arctic to deliver thermonuclear weapons, the Starfighter represented the ultimate quick reaction solution. But the aircraft had significant limitations that would profoundly affect its service career with the United States Air Force. Those tiny wings that gave it such remarkable high-speed performance made it treacherous and unforgiving at low speeds. The landing approach speed exceeded 190 miles per hour, far higher than contemporary fighters and approaching the cruise speed of civilian airliners. A moment's inattention during approach could be immediately fatal. Pilots learned to fly final approach with extreme precision, maintaining exact airspeed and descent rate. Any deviation invited disaster. Early production models featured a downward-firing ejection seat because Lockheed engineers feared that a pilot ejecting upward at high speed would strike the aircraft's tall T-shaped tail assembly. The tail sat directly above the cockpit, and at supersonic speeds the wind blast would push an ejecting pilot directly into it. The downward-firing seat seemed like an elegant solution. The pilot would be propelled away from the aircraft in a direction where no obstructions existed. The seat worked reasonably well at high altitudes where there was time for the pilot to separate from the seat and deploy his parachute before reaching the ground. But at low altitudes, the mathematics of physics took over. 21 American pilots died in low-altitude ejection attempts because the downward-firing seat drove them into the ground faster than their parachutes could deploy. The seat was eventually replaced with an upward-firing design powerful enough to throw the pilot clear of the tail, but the Starfighter's grim reputation as a dangerous aircraft was already firmly established. Range was another significant limitation that affected tactical employment. The F-104 simply could not carry enough internal fuel for the extended patrol missions required in continental air defense. External fuel tanks could be mounted on underwing pylons and on the centerline station beneath the fuselage, but these added aerodynamic drag and reduced the performance that made the aircraft attractive in the first place. The aircraft also lacked sophisticated all-weather radar and fire control systems in its early interceptor versions, limiting it to daylight operations in clear weather when pilots could visually acquire their targets. These multiple limitations made the Starfighter poorly suited for the continental air defense mission against Soviet bombers, which required long-endurance patrols over remote northern regions and the ability to operate in the clouds, darkness, and foul weather that characterized much of the year at high latitudes. By the early 1960s, Air Defense Command was steadily replacing its F-104s with longer range, all-weather interceptors like the Convair F-106 Delta Dart. The F-106 offered superior radar, much better range, and integrated fire control through the semi-automatic ground environment computer network that coordinated American air defenses across the entire continent. The Starfighter seemed destined for early retirement from active-duty Air Force service, relegated to Air National Guard units flying weekend missions and foreign export customers who valued its spectacular performance over its operational limitations. Then came October 1962, and everything changed. The Cuban Missile Crisis began on October 14, 1962, when a Lockheed U-2 high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft piloted by Major Richard Heiser photographed Soviet medium-range ballistic missile sites under construction near the town of San Cristobal in the western province of Pinar del Memoirs, Rio, Cuba. The developed film reached Washington the following day, and intelligence photo interpreters confirmed the worst fears of American strategists. The Soviet Union was deploying nuclear-armed missiles capable of striking most major American cities within minutes of launch. New York, Washington, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Miami, New Orleans, Houston, and dozens of other cities suddenly lay within range of Soviet warheads based less than 100 miles from Florida. President John Fitzgerald Kennedy learned of the discovery on October 16th. He immediately and secretly convened the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, a small group of the most senior officials in the American government who would meet almost continuously for the next 2 weeks. The deliberations were intense and often heated. Some advisors, including all the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, argued passionately for immediate airstrikes to destroy the missiles before they could become operational, followed by a full-scale amphibious invasion of Cuba to overthrow the Castro government once and for all. They produced detailed military plans showing how such an operation might unfold. Others, including Attorney General Robert Kennedy and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, advocated a more measured response that would give the Soviets an opportunity to withdraw their missiles without losing face, thereby avoiding a direct military confrontation that could escalate to nuclear war. The debate raged for days, while American military forces quietly and secretly prepared for combat. On October 22, President Kennedy addressed the American people on national television in one of the most consequential speeches in the history of the Cold War. He announced the presence of Soviet offensive missiles in Cuba, declared a naval quarantine of the island to prevent additional weapons from arriving by sea, and demanded that the Soviets immediately dismantle and remove the missiles already in place. His voice was calm, but the implications of his words were terrifying. He promised massive retaliation against the Soviet Union itself if any missile launched from Cuba struck any nation in the Western Hemisphere. The world held its breath. As the president spoke at 7 o'clock in the evening Eastern Standard Time, the American military machine was already moving toward a war footing. All United States military forces worldwide went to Defense Condition 3. Strategic Air Command advanced further to Defense Condition 2, the highest state of readiness short of actual war, for the first time during a direct superpower nuclear confrontation. B-52 Stratofortress bombers loaded with thermonuclear weapons were placed on continuous airborne alert. Approximately 65 aircraft, 1/8 of the entire B-52 force, remained airborne around the clock, flying predetermined routes that would carry them toward Soviet targets if the order came to attack. B-47 medium bombers dispersed to civilian airports and military airfields across the country, ready to take off at 15 minutes' notice. 145 intercontinental ballistic missiles in hardened underground silos were placed on full combat alert, some targeted at Cuba itself. The buildup of tactical forces in Florida was staggering in both speed and scale. Air Defense Command deployed 161 nuclear-armed fighter interceptors to 16 dispersal airfields within just 9 hours of the alert order. These aircraft, primarily F-101 Voodoos, F-102 Delta Daggers, and F-106 Delta Darts, carried Falcon and Genie air-to-air missiles with small nuclear warheads. A single nuclear-armed interceptor could destroy an entire formation of enemy bombers with one shot. About 1/3 of these aircraft were placed on 15-minute alert status, pilots standing by in ready rooms, able to launch on short notice. By the height of the crisis, approximately 150 fighter interceptors were stationed in Florida alone, with dozens on 5-minute alert and more on 15-minute and 1 to 3 hour alert status. Air Defense Command flew more than 13,000 sorties during the crisis period, with approximately 2,800 of those flown from bases in Florida. 22 Air Defense Command interceptors were actually airborne over Florida at the moment. President Kennedy began his television address, circling in racetrack patterns over the Keys and the southern peninsula, in case Cuban aircraft attempted a preemptive strike against American military bases during the speech. This precaution reflected genuine concern about Cuban air capabilities. Intelligence had tracked the arrival of advanced Soviet aircraft on the island throughout 1962, though the full extent of the deployment remained unknown to American analysts. The crisis produced moments of absolute terror that remained classified for decades after the events. On October 27th, the day that became known among historians as Black Saturday, 3 separate incidents nearly triggered the war. Both sides were desperately struggling to avoid. Major Rudolph Anderson, Jr., a veteran reconnaissance pilot from the 4080th Strategic Reconnaissance Wing, was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missile while conducting a U-2 photo mission over the eastern end of the island. The missile crew acted without explicit authorization from the Soviet High Command in Moscow. Anderson's aircraft was struck at approximately 72,000 feet over Baines and destroyed instantly. He became the only American combat fatality of the entire Cuban confrontation. His death nearly triggered the retaliatory airstrikes against Cuban air defenses that would have served as the prelude to full-scale invasion. Simultaneously, another U-2, piloted by Captain Charles Maltzby from Eielson Air Force Base in Alaska, strayed more than 300 miles into Soviet airspace over the Chukotka Peninsula due to navigation errors caused by aurora borealis interference with his compass. Soviet MiG-19 interceptors from the air defense forces scrambled to shoot down the intruder. American F-102 Delta Daggers launched from Galena Air Force Base in Alaska to protect Maltzby, and these interceptors carried GAR-11 Falcon air-to-air missiles with nuclear warheads under their wings. Had the American fighters engaged the Soviet MiGs with nuclear weapons, the escalation would almost certainly have been catastrophic. Maltzby managed to glide his fuel-starved U-2 back to Alaska before the opposing interceptors met. A third incident occurred at a Minnesota air base, where a bear climbing a security fence triggered an alarm system. Due to a wiring error, the alarm that sounded at Volk Field Air National Guard Base in Wisconsin indicated that nuclear-armed F-106 Delta Darts should scramble for immediate combat. Pilots raced toward their aircraft and engines began to start before an officer realized the error and drove a vehicle onto the runway to stop the launch. President Kennedy reportedly remarked about the cascade of errors on that terrible day that there was always some SOB who did not get the word. The crisis ultimately ended through frantic back-channel diplomacy. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove the offensive missiles from Cuba in exchange for an American public pledge not to invade the island, and a secret agreement to withdraw American Jupiter intermediate-range ballistic missiles from Turkey. By late November, the missiles were being dismantled, and the Ilyushin Il-28 Beagle bombers that had also been deployed to Cuba were being crated for shipment back to the Soviet Union. The world stepped back from the brink of thermonuclear annihilation, but the crisis had revealed something deeply troubling about American air defenses, something that demanded immediate correction. The encounter on November 4th demonstrated the problem with brutal clarity. Unknown to the American intelligence community, the Soviets had secretly deployed 40 MiG-21 F-13 fighters to Cuba in September 1962 under the cover name Operation Anadyr. These were among the most advanced interceptors in the entire Soviet inventory, true Mach 2 aircraft with sophisticated radar and weapons systems. They were flown exclusively by experienced Soviet pilots from the 32nd Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, which had been redesignated the 213th Fighter Aviation Regiment for the deployment to maintain secrecy. The first MiG-21 had flown over Cuban soil on September 18, 1962. American signals, intelligence, and aerial reconnaissance had completely missed their arrival, despite the intensive surveillance of Cuba during the crisis period. When one of these aircraft intercepted and simulated an attack on two American F-104Cs, it proved beyond any doubt that Cuba now possessed an air combat capability that demanded an immediate and permanent American response. The threat was no longer theoretical or speculative. It was real, documented, and extremely dangerous. Soviet supersonic fighters could reach Florida in minutes. Something decisive had to be done to guard the southeastern United States against what now constituted a permanent aerial threat just 90 miles from American territory. The air defense establishment studied the problem intensively and reached an unusual conclusion. The very limitations that had made the F-104 unsuitable for continental defense against Soviet bombers crossing the Arctic suddenly became advantages in the new Cuba mission. There was no requirement for long patrol range when the enemy was based merely 90 miles away across the Straits of Florida. There was no necessity for all-weather capability in the subtropical climate of South Florida, where clear skies predominated throughout most of the year. The confined operational area eliminated the endurance concerns that had plagued the Starfighter in other deployment scenarios. What mattered now was raw performance, the ability to climb, intercept, and engage enemy fighters in the minimum possible time. Against Cuban MiGs, the F-104 was uniquely and ideally suited. On February 27, 1963, the first F-104A Starfighters of the 319th Fighter Interceptor Squadron touched down at Homestead Air Force Base, Florida. The squadron had relocated from Bunker Hill Air Force Base in Indiana, receiving aircraft withdrawn from Air National Guard units that had been federalized during the Berlin Crisis of 1961. Their mission briefing was simple and unambiguous: guard the southeastern United States against Cuban air attack. Be ready to fight at any moment of any day. The 319th assumed its operational alert posture on April 15, 1963, replacing the F-102 Delta Daggers of the 325th Fighter Interceptor Squadron that had handled the mission during the crisis period. The unit organized into 3 operational flights with color-coded designations. A. Flight was yellow, B. Flight was red, C. Flight was blue. These 3 flights rotated through continuous 5-minute alert duty around the clock, every day of the year, for the next 6 years without interruption. 5-minute alert meant exactly what the name implied. Pilots sat in air-conditioned ready rooms adjacent to their parked and armed aircraft, flight suits on, helmets and gloves within arm's reach. They played cards, read magazines, watched television, and tried to stay mentally sharp while waiting for a scramble that might never come but could come at any second. When the scramble horn sounded, they had 300 seconds to run to their jets, strap in, start engines, taxi to the runway, and be airborne. The aircraft were maintained in a constant state of combat readiness. Ground crews worked around the clock to ensure every alert bird could fly on a moment's notice. The AIM-9B Sidewinder missiles hung on their wingtip rails, warheads live and ready. After 1964, when the modification program was completed, the M61 Vulcan cannon was fully loaded with high-explosive incendiary ammunition. Daily life at Homestead Air Force Base in the Florida heat revolved entirely around the alert cycle. Pilots rotated through alert duty, training flights, and administrative time in an exhausting schedule that left little room for anything else. During their non-alert periods, they practiced relentlessly the skills that might someday be needed in actual combat. The squadron flew double-attack intercept procedures at least 3 times per week, practicing the coordinated attacks by pairs of fighters that maximized the probability of destroying an enemy aircraft. 9 4-ship formations flew air-to-air gunnery missions every week, firing live ammunition at towed aerial targets over the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean. Pilots became extraordinarily proficient with both missiles and guns, learning to hit targets while maneuvering at high speed and extreme altitude. The squadron regularly intercepted U-2 reconnaissance aircraft conducting training flights above 60,000 feet. These missions pushed the starfighters to the absolute ragged edge of their performance envelope, climbing into the dark blue edge of space to practice engagements against targets flying higher than almost any other aircraft could reach. Dissimilar air combat training missions pitted the F-104s against F-4 Phantoms from nearby Tactical Air Command units and F-106 Delta Darts from other Air Defense Command squadrons. These exercises revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of each aircraft type against different opponents, helping pilots understand when to press an attack and when discretion demanded disengagement. The threat they trained constantly to counter was substantial and growing. Pilots of the 319th estimated they faced roughly 125 Cuban MiG-21s based at airfields across the Straits of Florida. This number grew throughout the 1960s as the Soviet Union continued supplying additional aircraft to Castro's Revolutionary Air Force. By 1968, Cuba also operated MiG-21PF and MiG-21PFM variants with improved radar and genuine all-weather capability, alongside approximately 100 MiG-17s that had arrived, starting in early 1964. The MiG-17 was a subsonic aircraft, limited to roughly 670 miles per hour, but it was a proven combat machine that had performed effectively in Vietnam against American fighters, including the sophisticated F-4 Phantom. In skilled hands, the MiG-17 remained dangerous. Training for Cuban pilots had begun shortly after the 1959 revolution that brought Castro to power. The first group of aviation cadets traveled to Czechoslovakia for instruction on MiG-15 jet fighters in 1961. Subsequent classes trained in the Soviet Union itself, learning to fly the more advanced MiG-17 and MiG-21 under the supervision of experienced Soviet instructors. Some Cuban aviators received additional instruction in the People's Republic of China as well. American National Security Agency listening posts intercepted Russian ground controllers speaking in heavily accented Spanish to Cuban pilots, conducting training flights as early as fall 1962, providing evidence of ongoing and intensive Soviet involvement in developing Cuban air combat capabilities. The 319th Starfighters underwent constant upgrades throughout their deployment to maintain technological superiority over the evolving Cuban threat. In late 1967, 26 aircraft received the significantly more powerful J-79 GE-19 engine. This modification pushed the service ceiling beyond 73,000 feet and dramatically improved both climb rate and acceleration. Pilots who flew the modified aircraft enthusiastically claimed they could reach altitudes approaching 100,000 feet in zoom, climb profiles that traded kinetic energy for altitude. Several suggested the squadron attempt official world record runs to demonstrate what the upgraded aircraft could do. Air Force headquarters refused permission. It would have been professionally embarrassing for an aircraft designed in 1956 to set new world altitude records in 1967 or 68. The squadron produced its share of distinguished aviators during its 6 years at Homestead. Lieutenant Colonel Walt Bjornaby served from 1964 to 1967 and later became one of the most experienced F-104 pilots in the entire world. Captain Gary Pearson, who served from 1963 to 1966, became the first pilot anywhere to log 1,000 flight hours in F-104A and B model aircraft. Captain J.D. Dunn earned the prestigious William Tell Top Gun Award at the 1965 weapons competition, demonstrating superior gunnery and intercept skills against the best pilots from across Air Defense Command. Captain Bob Sweetwood made the record books at the same competition by hitting 14 consecutive towed aerial targets with cannon fire, an extraordinary demonstration of precision marksmanship from an aircraft traveling at several hundred miles per hour. But the most memorable moment in the 319th's entire history came not from combat readiness or competitive excellence. It came from complete and utter failure. On the morning of October 5, 1969, a Cuban MiG-17 appeared over Homestead Air Force Base without any warning whatsoever. Lieutenant Eduardo Guerra Jimenez had taken off from Santa Clara Airfield in central Cuba and flown at extremely low altitude across the Florida Straits, staying below the coverage of American ground-based radar stations. He hugged the wave tops, his aircraft occasionally disappearing behind the swells, weaving between fishing boats and oil platforms as he approached the Florida coast. Guerra Jimenez crossed into American sovereign airspace completely undetected. He flew over the Florida Keys without triggering a single alarm at any radar site or warning station. He proceeded up the mainland coast toward Homestead without any American aircraft scrambling to intercept him. He entered the standard traffic pattern at Homestead Air Force Base, as if he were simply another aircraft in the sequence, lowered his landing gear, and touched down smoothly on the main runway. He taxied his MiG-17 across the ramp and shut down his engine right beside Air Force One, the president's personal Boeing 707 aircraft, which was parked on the tarmac awaiting Richard Nixon's arrival for an official visit to South Florida. The scramble horn never sounded. By the time ground crews understood what had happened, the Cuban pilot had already climbed out of his cockpit and was standing beside his aircraft requesting political asylum. A crew chief from the 319th later recalled running toward the flight line, preparing to strap into his Starfighter for an immediate launch, only to be told that the intruder had already landed safely. There was no one left to intercept. The air defense network that had spent 6 years preparing to intercept Cuban aircraft had completely missed one flying directly into the very heart of its own base. Guerra Jimenez was a defector seeking political asylum in the United States, not an attacker on a strike mission. He had no bombs aboard, no weapons armed, no hostile intent of any kind. But the implications of his successful penetration were absolutely devastating. If one MiG-17 could cross the Florida Straits undetected, fly up the coast without challenge, and land at a major military installation without triggering any intercept response, others could theoretically do exactly the same thing while carrying weapons. The entire air defense concept upon which the 319th mission was based had been proven inadequate. Congressional hearings followed in Washington. Investigators examined radar coverage gaps along the Florida Straits and the coast of the Florida Peninsula. They questioned why low-altitude approaches from the south had not been better monitored despite 6 years of identifying Cuba as the primary air threat. They demanded to know how a Cuban military aircraft could reach Homestead without triggering any alert whatsoever. The incident provided political momentum for the Airborne Warning and Control System program, the E-3AWACS aircraft, that would eventually provide continuous radar coverage from high altitude over areas that ground-based stations could not effectively monitor due to the curvature of the Earth and the limitations of line of tour. Site radar propagation. The 319th Fighter Interceptor Squadron remained at Homestead until December 1969, when the Air Force finally retired its last active duty F-104 Starfighters from the Interceptor mission. The squadron had operated 40 F-104As and 4 two-seat F-104B trainers over its 6-year deployment. Not a single aircraft had fired its weapons in anger against a Cuban target. Not a single pilot had engaged in actual aerial combat. The entire 6-year mission had been one of pure deterrence. The F-104 Starfighter was designed as a weapon of war, a supersonic interceptor meant to destroy enemy bombers before they could deliver nuclear weapons against American cities. In its Cuban deployment at Homestead, it served a different but equally vital purpose. It was a visible symbol of American commitment, a technological statement that the southeastern United States would be defended against any aerial aggression from the island nation 90 miles away. The pilots who flew those missions are now elderly men, their service 6 decades in the past. The aircraft they flew have been retired for more than 50 years, survivors preserved only in aviation museums. The Soviet Union that supplied Cuba with MiGs ceased to exist in 1991, yet the Florida Straits remain, and the tensions that once made those warm blue waters among the most dangerous airspace in the world have never entirely disappeared. Cuba's fighter force remained active and occasionally lethal long after the Starfighters departed Florida. On February 24, 1996, more than a quarter-century after the 319th stood down, a Cuban MiG-21 Fulcrum fighter shot down 2 Cessna 337 Skymaster light aircraft operated by Brothers to the Rescue, a Cuban-American humanitarian organization that searched for refugees in the Florida Straits. 4 people died in the attack, 3 American citizens and 1 permanent resident. American intelligence intercepted radio communications between the Cuban fighter pilot and ground controllers during the engagement. One transmission became internationally infamous. After firing the missile that destroyed the second unarmed Cessna in international airspace, a Cuban pilot announced in crude Spanish that he had struck the target and destroyed it completely. His wingman responded with enthusiastic profanity. United States Ambassador to the United Nations Madeleine Albright later read the translated communications at the Security Council, displaying the transcript for the assembled delegates. She denounced the shoot-down as an act of cowardice rather than courage. The incident demonstrated that Cuban fighters remained a lethal force 3 full decades after the original crisis that had brought Soviet jets to the island, and that the willingness to use them against civilians had not diminished. Today, the F-104 Starfighter survives primarily in museums and memorial displays around the world. Examples are exhibited at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, at air parks and aviation collections across Europe, Japan, and throughout the Western Hemisphere. Their needle-sharp noses point toward skies they once dominated. The aircraft that Kelly Johnson designed to be the fastest climbing, highest flying interceptor of its generation achieved every goal he set and more. It held world records that stood for years. It served with more than a dozen air forces on 4 continents. It remained in operational service with some nations into the 21st century. The 319th Fighter Interceptor Squadron traces its organizational lineage all the way back to World War II, when the unit flew Republic P-47 Thunderbolt fighters in the Pacific Theater, supporting the bloody island-hopping campaign against Imperial Japan. The squadron has been activated, inactivated, and redesignated numerous times in the decades since its Homestead deployment, serving in various roles according to changing Air Force mission requirements. Its 6 years guarding the Florida Straits remains a unique and largely unknown chapter in a long and distinguished history, a Cold War mission against an enemy base close enough to see on a clear day from the Florida coast. The 90 miles of water separating Florida from Cuba remain exactly as they have always been. The straits that American and Cuban pilots once watched with such lethal intensity still separate the two nations. Cuba's Air Force continues to operate in the 21st century, though its inventory has aged dramatically since the collapse of the Soviet Union ended the supply of modern replacement aircraft and spare parts. Some MiG-21s reportedly remain in limited service more than 60 years after they first arrived to challenge American starfighters over the Caribbean. Whether they could still fight effectively is an open question debated by defense analysts. Whether they will ever need to is another question entirely. The story of the F-104 Starfighter and its vigil against Cuban MiGs deserves to be remembered. The men of the 319th Fighter Interceptor Squadron held the line when the line needed holding. They were ready when readiness mattered most, and they helped keep a fragile peace during years when that peace hung by the thinnest of threads over the warm blue waters between two nations that have never truly made peace with one another. That is their legacy. That is their contribution to history.